Welcome to Indigenous Women Leaders Shaping Environmental Justice. I'm Juliana Ojeda, Program Associate at Green 2.0. At Green 2.0, we recognize that people of color are most impacted by environmental problems, but least represented in positions of power. Our organization works to increase diversity in the environmental movement and ensure that organizations are inclusive and equitable. Indigenous women have long been at the forefront of shaping the environmental movement. However, recognition of their leadership and their representation in decision-making roles within environmental organizations is lacking. During today's event, we will hear from Indigenous women leaders who are leading sustainability and environmental justice effort in their communities for a discussion on creating practices and efforts that allow Indigenous women to thrive. A few housekeeping notes before we start. We are live captioning today's event. If you have any questions throughout the event, please put them in the Q&A box. We will try our best to address all your questions during our Q&A time at the end of the panel. And this event is recorded and you will receive an email tomorrow with a recording of the event. Thank you all so much for joining us today. And I will now go ahead and ask our panelists to come on screen and please introduce themselves and answer the question, what is a person or place that brings you joy and peace?
I'll go first. Hessa Halt, Claire Louise Quest, Chinaslemti. Good afternoon. My name is Claire Charlo. I'm Bitterroot Salish from Montana. That is where I live right now on the Flathead Reservation. I work for Indigenous Environmental Network as the Indigenous Feminisms organizer. And I'm really happy to be here. Was there another question on that?
Yes, the question to answer is, what is a person or place that brings you joy and peace?
Okay, I'm gonna always say the mountains that are on our reservation. I go and pick medicine. We call it husk, but other folks call it bear root, and pick huckleberries all summer long. That is my place of joy.
I can jump in. Sego Sarguego. My name is Carole Monture. I am Mohawk Wolf Clan from Six Nations of the Grand River Territory, where I'm calling to you from. I am the Climate Leadership Coordinator at Indigenous Climate Action. A place that brings me joy and peace is my community, Six Nations. We're the only place, the only community that has all Six Nations of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy together. So I always say there you could go. There's no place on earth quite like Six Nations. You could go anywhere, you know, mountain views, warmer winters, but you'll never find a place quite like Six. It brings me some other emotions, but that's a discussion for another day. Yeah.
Walito Nali, good morning, afternoon, whatever time you find yourselves in, my relatives. My name is Niria Alicia Garcia. I am Chicana Indígena, Mexica, Purépecha, Rarámuri descendant. My pronouns are we. I have a 16-month-old, so I've been using that pronoun extensively. We, she, ella, yausiwa. I have the honor and responsibility and privilege of being co-founder and co-chair of Coalición Fortaleza. I lead development work with Sawamem, an Indigenous-led nonprofit working to resource and restore the sacred. And I also have the honor of being a Green 2.0 board member. And this question of what is a person or place that brings you joy and peace took me straight to my grandmother's adobe stove in Mexico. Because last week I was visiting my mom and I was making tortillas, and for the first time my tortillas started to fluff up, and my mom looked at me and she's like, "You're a woman." And I was like, "I don't know what I was before, Mom, but I'll take it." And it just my grandma's no longer here, but it just made me so tender to be like, oh, she would be so proud of me. Seeing, you know, you always wonder, because I don't do this every day, you know, if I didn't know if they were ever going to fluff up, but they did. So felt like it was a threshold and that abuelita would be so proud of me.
We'd love to hear more about the work you're all currently doing. What are some environmental projects that y'all are working on within your Indigenous communities? Claire, if you'd like to go ahead and start us.
Sure. So I am really elated to say that the job that I'm in right now is my dream job, because the goal is to bring back matriarchy into environmental justice work. Indigenous women have been on the forefront, have been on the front lines of the climate justice fights. Yet we're rarely in leadership positions. A lot of the time it's because we are in the kitchens, we are doing the actual labor of these movements. I want to center Indigenous matriarchy. Unfortunately, a lot of organizations still kind of follow colonial and patriarchal roles. And I just feel that by bringing matriarchy back into the discussion, by talking about the feminist economy, which is very similar to the regenerative economy, and the care economy, where we center life at the forefront, you know, instead of capitalism, instead of extractive industries. The work that I'm doing is always trying to connect violence against the land and violence against Indigenous women, femmes, and Two-Spirit. Even though that violence exists, we're still on the front lines of every climate justice battle. And so bringing matriarchy back into this climate justice battleground is something that I feel is very important, because unfortunately, Indigenous women, Two-Spirit, and femmes are paying the price. There are attacks on body autonomy, whether it be the right to choose, whether it be the right to be trans. And so it is really important to elevate those issues when we're talking about the climate justice fight, because it all ties back into rematriation. And so I am starting curriculum for Indigenous matriarchy in the climate justice. We're also looking at health data and how extractive industries impact Indigenous women with violence and through health. So that's just the beginning of the work that I do. I'm also attending COP and the UN and representing women and gender as an Indigenous femme. So thank you. And I can pass it on to Carole and Niria.
Yeah, thanks, Claire. I can jump in. So in my professional life at Indigenous Climate Action, the Indigenous Environmental Network is actually our sister organization. So we work fairly closely with the IENT. So at Indigenous Climate Action, I am the Climate Leadership Coordinator. So the Climate Leadership Program is a popular education style community workshop by and for Indigenous people about climate change. And we position decolonization and Indigenous rights and knowledge as a primary solution to the climate crisis. And the curriculum was developed over a period of years, and it came out of a stated need to have more specific climate change information that's relatable to Indigenous communities. So it was developed through community workshops, interviews, and we've developed it into our toolkit that includes our curriculum guide, our training, and soon to be our knowledge guide. So I've been in this role for about 2 years now, and I've had the honor of being able to train about 100 people from mainly within so-called Canada, from every province and territory. We've had some trainings as well south of the medicine line, expanding that out. We have one in my own community at Six Nations. We are the most populous Indigenous First Nations community in the country, actually. And in my sort of more personal life, I also volunteer with an organization called Protect the Tract. And we are a Haudenosaunee-led project that conducts research, policy development, and develops capacity for civil engagement to exercise sovereignty through the promotion of land stewardship. So we're in the process of regenerating a lot of our cultural practices as environmentalism. And again, like part of that step of like a regenerative economy, an Indigenous feminist economy. And one of the things that we're working on is actually developing our own community climate action strategy, which is really exciting because there actually isn't any comprehensive climate action strategy for our territories through any of the like conservation authorities. So we're very much in the research and development stage on that, but I'm really excited for what the future holds on that.
Thank you, Carole and Claire. This is Niria. So I've had the honor in the past 3 years of being involved in 3 really incredible community-led initiatives. In 2020, in September of 2020, mid-pandemic, pre-vaccine, where we were in full swing with COVID, my hometown community of Southern Oregon in the Rogue Valley was deeply devastated and impacted by wildfires that actually weren't wildfires. They were fires within urban boundary. And we lost over 2,800 structures overnight. And as you know, it was my community that was most impacted. The undocumented elder, farm worker, mixed status, Latine, Indigenous community. And then we found ourselves in this recovery process where everything was in English, there was no translation. And it was our community that took on over 60% of the losses in 2020. We were so lucky to have elders and mentors who guided us, and in some of those recovery meetings, our community growing tired and exhausted of the bureaucratic processes that we then find ourselves in the midst of recovery. We looked around the room and said, what are we waiting for? We have the construction workers here, we have the electricians here, the gardeners, we have every skill set that we need to rebuild our own communities. What is the holdup? And one elder who is now an ancestor, Don Leon, so he passed away from COVID, he stood up and he said, well, why don't we buy our neighborhoods back? And that set us off on this journey and this prayer to do exactly that. And just last year, we were able to close on one park to buy it back. And this time have our community members be the owners, right? Because, you know, I don't know if you know, but manufactured home parks, when they burn down, even though you own the house on it, you don't own the land. So what was happening is a lot of capitalist investors were just waiting to see who would pay the highest price or if it was even worth their investment. So next year, we're going to be welcoming families back as owners. And that's what is going to support us in the future, because it's not about a matter of if, it's a matter of when climate change is going to knock on your door. And then just recently on Indigenous Peoples Day this year, 2023, I had the honor of being a part of a small epic team that rematriated 1,100 acres of Winnemem Wintu lands for Chief Cali and Sisk and the tribe. And we closed on Indigenous Peoples Day. Again, as another strategy to take back the power to steward the lands, to bring back the balance that is needed, right? One of the first projects that we're going to be working on is bringing back some of those cultural burns to heal the land around the village, and also create resiliency for the neighborhoods that are around the village as well. Climate resilience, Indigenous-led climate resilience work doesn't just benefit Indigenous people, it benefits all of life.
All right, thank you all so much. I will now pass over my moderating duties to Krystal. She will take over from here and introduce herself.
Thank you. Peveshev, Mene Wostatna Nehav. My name is Krystal Tubles. I'm Oglala Lakota, Northern Cheyenne. She, her pronouns. I'm the executive director of Honor the Earth and very honored to be here. My apologies for being a little bit late. I was supporting our Palestinian brothers and sisters in their struggle. So a little bit late getting to here, but I'm very honored to be here and to engage in this conversation with such powerful, powerful women in our communities. And so with that, we'll move into the next question. Basically, based on the work that you've shared thus far, we know that, the climate movement cannot be successful without incorporating environmental justice, right? More expansive. So just curious about how you as Indigenous women leaders, how do you view your role in creating an equitable movement space? And we can go and we can possibly start with Claire.
Kind of touched on this when I talked about rematriation, bringing back matriarchy. And matriarchy is more than just a word. Matriarchy is ceremony. Matriarchy is centering life, and I find that a lot of organizations move in very colonial and patriarchal ways, and a lot of it does not work in sync with Indigenous women that are trying to live within matriarchal values, which is putting family, community ahead of like extractivism, ahead of capitalism. And so I think that also the ceremony piece is really important. When we had a gathering, we had a matriarch gathering last May, and when I talk about matriarchy and Indigenous solidarity, I'm talking about global indigeneity, because we try to work a lot with Indigenous siblings from South America. So we brought in some people from Brazil, Charlene and Milvian and Lisette from Guatemala. And it's amazing and powerful how similar our ceremonies are, and also how similar our struggles are. And by being able to be together, we may not understand the same language, but we can be together in ceremony. And that was one of the most incredibly uplifting pieces of the work that I'm doing. Is I understand that every tribe and every region have different ceremonies, and we will all do our own ways. But bringing ceremony back into our work is something that I feel is really important. It also helps us ground ourselves, and it keeps us from burning out in a lot of ways, because that's another thing, is capacity, is how we don't put ourselves first, because everything else is everything else is such more important. Our children, our community, our environment, our lands, our animals. And, so I'm always trying to take care of myself while I'm taking care of others. And I'll just stop there and I'll pass it on to Carole.
Yeah, thanks, Claire. I think in this role, like in this movement work, I think everyone has a role to play, and everybody has a gift that they were given, and everyone has they bring that gift into the work that they do. And for me, a lot of my, I view my role as being as a communicator. In my role professionally, I try to convey knowledge about the climate crisis and the role of Indigenous knowledge to my community and Indigenous communities more broadly. Again, I think our people have such an understanding of our land that we understand like what caused the climate crisis, how it's unfolding, and all of the factors at play. But having that like the more specific knowledge, I think, is like a really important piece of power to have. And I think a really important role when I get to do the trainings and work with people is to uplift other people's voices. And that's something that Indigenous Climate Action, it's one of our guiding missions and values, is to uplift Indigenous voices and sovereignty and stewardship over the lands and waters for the generations to come. And I really want to be able to create spaces where people, especially Indigenous people, Indigenous women, young Indigenous women, feel empowered to do so. They feel encouraged. I always tell people, I went to undergrad for Indigenous studies, but I don't have any particular background in science or climate science. And so if I'm able to do this, so can anybody. And I also find a lot of the times women, and Indigenous women in particular, we often will hold ourselves back from certain things. Like when a question comes up, we're kind of like, oh, am I qualified to answer this? Is there somebody who's better qualified? Like, we kind of hold ourselves back. And I think it's really important to encourage people and women to speak up and to use their voices and to create a space where they feel safe to do so. And creating an environment where people feel capable and competent to take action, and that they have the knowledge and the skills already to do so. So I always want to create a space in my trainings where people, leave a little bit better than they joined us. So I'd say that's my role.
Yeah. Niria, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, thank you, Krystal. Well, I don't have much to add. I think Claire and Carole shared this really well, but responded to this question really beautifully. I think the only thing I wanted to add to it, in thinking back of when I was way more active in the youth climate justice movement, it's so easy for us to come in as young people or as new people to a movement and forget that there was elders that on whose shoulders we are standing on, that opened the doors that needed to be opened for us to get to a place where we could join that movement. And a lot of the times in the climate movement, I've seen a lack of deep study in understanding that there's principles, there's elders in the space who organized before we were born, right? Like, so when Claire says, we got to bring ceremony and lead with that, that's actually in the environmental justice principles, which is, I'm gonna drop it in the chat because I know most people, I was like, hey, have you seen the environmental justice principles? They're like, oh, I didn't even know that existed. It's like, yes, in 1991, people got together and said, this is how we're gonna lead a movement across cultures, across territories, across differences. And the first principle in that document affirms the sacredness of Mother Earth. The sacredness and importance of ecological unity, the interdependence of all species, and the right to be free from ecological destruction. That's the first principle. And, but oftentimes it doesn't feel like that when we're in these meetings and it's like business as usual, right? Like we lack that connection to spirit and starting there in that deep acknowledgement. So I think a way that we can make the climate movement more equitable is asking ourselves these questions. How are we honoring the sacredness of Mother Earth that is inherently anti-capitalist, inherently anti-war? It inherently centers elders, children, disabled folks, right? So yeah, maybe asking ourselves that next time we're in a meeting about whatever it is that we're in a meeting about, thinking we're going to organize and bring about that justice. Well, yeah, starting with prayer, starting with leading with our culture, and really being in that together, I think is important.
Thank you all so much. That was so powerful to hear it. And just hearing the unique perspective that Indigenous women, Indigenous peoples, but most especially Indigenous women have when we're in these spaces is so, so powerful. I think that leads us into the next question. Y'all did a perfect segue into that of just, as women, as Indigenous peoples, we do hold a very unique space in this movement space, right? And so really thinking about that, how have you been able to actually incorporate your culture and your beliefs and your practices into the work? As the first question. And then secondarily, how has that impacted your interactions with other folks, your organization, within NGOs, within nonprofits, but even within movement spaces, how has our ability to show up as who we are impacted that interaction? So I can either start with a volunteer.
Hi, I'll go. So I am incredibly blessed and grateful to work with Indigenous Environmental Network, where they do center ceremony, culture at the forefront of everything that we do. Trying to bring that into other spaces is always challenging, other non-Indigenous spaces. I feel like a lot of times it is, it's generally welcomed, but it's almost tokenized. Like they'll be like, at the very last minute, oh, Claire, can you give a prayer as an afterthought, not as a forethought, so they're just, and so I try to be extremely respectful, because I think that a lot of non-Indigenous people are coming to the realization, especially like organizations, green organizations where they want to be inclusive. And so I think it's just teaching them how to be inclusive in a respective way, not as an afterthought. Because I feel like I almost feel like it's an afterthought a lot. And navigating spaces are very challenging. I don't want to be a token, but I always want to represent my culture and my ceremonial values without feeling like I'm commodifying them. Because I feel like a lot of the environmental destruction is about the commodification of Earth, about the commodification of our Father Sky and Mother Earth and our, everything that is living. There is a price tag on it. And with the matriarchal lens, nothing is for sale. And we all belong to each other. So it's difficult to navigate the space. Also, like, there's also times where I feel like it's strategic, I will try really hard to explain how I feel, but I will never cut off a relationship because I feel like they may have misstepped. I think that navigating it in a good, gentle way, but also holding firm to my boundaries is really important because I feel like people are learning as they go. But there are times when you just have to say that does not align with my values and I'm going to step back. And knowing when that is really important. And sometimes I don't. I'm still learning and navigating as I go. So thank you for that question.
Yeah, Carole, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I think I can chime in. I do try to bring my Haudenosaunee worldview and cultures and value into the work that I do. And like Clara, I also feel really, really blessed to be involved with an organization that I feel reflects my values and makes space for that and encourages me to, hold those boundaries, like she said, and create those relationships. I think one thing that guides my work and everything is what's called our Thanksgiving address. We're very well known for this. It's called the words before all else. And this is something that we do before and after every single gathering. And it's a process of giving thanks to the natural world and understanding your place in relation to it. And so we start with the earth, the people, we go through all of the waters, the plants, the animals, everything. And I think when you are always coming at that place of thankfulness for the natural world, of understanding your place in relation to it, that shapes my environmental work in a way that's often different, I think, than the mainstream environmental justice movement. And so when I'm in spaces, that guides everything that I do. And again, like I mentioned earlier, we also have like a cultural value of providing words of encouragement to people, uplifting voices. When we're in communities, I also will always sort of default to their practices and their protocols. I never want to come into a community and say, you need to do this, or as an authority. I'm coming in again as a relative and just like viewing myself in relation to other people. And again, like treating everybody like family. I've been able to go to different places, into communities, and just having that worldview, I think, just like shapes everything. I think oftentimes, especially in the mainstream world, a lot of authority is given to your qualifications, your titles, and Indigenous communities, we don't really do that in the same way, and a lot of it is just in how you show up. And I think that like reads through, and so we're able to, when we give trainings, we get generally very positive feedback about how we show up and encourage people. And so that's something I try to do internally within my organization and externally in spaces like this and elsewhere. So I'll pass.
Thanks, Carole. This is Niria. So in my tradition, I'm a moon dancer, and one of the things that my elder says after the 4 days of our ceremony, once we're like tired, we did all, we were just like deep in ceremony for 4 days, and we're like, okay, time to go home. All right, we did the ceremony. And she always says, hey, the ceremony begins when you leave these grounds. And because this is a so this is a ceremony that we're bringing back, right? And I'm kind of like the generation in my lineage. I'm the first woman to be born in a hospital. There's a lot that of reclamation work that will be my lifetime's responsibility to do. And because I didn't grow up in my homelands, there's a like, you're always fighting the internalized colonizer that we learned going through public schools, not growing up on our homelands, not like just growing up in settler society where productivity is valued, extractivism is like just a world that has completely different values. So it's taken me some time to finally be like, okay, I got to take my elders seriously and really say, all right, when I leave here, it begins with like this is when the ceremony begins, right? So this year, our retreat, it was a 4-day retreat. So we kind of led it like ceremony, right? We start with prayer. We start with setting down our altar and calling on our ancestors, asking for permission. Just being like you said, Carole, in that relationship and that awareness of how dependent we are and how much we rely on everything around us to exist. Of course, when I feel like when we do try to show up with these values, it interrupts, like it makes people uncomfortable. People are like, when because it's clashing against this other culture of capitalism, individualism. And so a lot of times I feel wrong. Like I have felt wrong. I'm proud to say that through the years, I've been like, no, I believe in this. Like, I believe that I don't care if it takes us 20 minutes to pray. If we saved someone's life in this meeting and that's all we did, that's okay. And that clashes with the internalized colonizer and everyone of like, oh, we didn't get to what we needed to get to. It's like, well, maybe all you needed to get to was to hear that one of your community members is suicidal, and and this meeting saved their life, right? So that in itself is like, we have to be very patient. We have to be very strong as Indigenous women to know that we are not crazy and we're not alone, and that we're actually doing what is needed of us in this time, and be very patient with ourselves and with other folks that just move in a different way. But quite honestly, I think we need to be leading more and following Indigenous women leadership, because the way we've been doing things is leading us to the brink of extinction. So there's some deep need for us to really interrogate the busyness and interrogate all of these ways that have not yielded positive results.
Thank you for that. Yes. No, this is a core fact that we know, right? When Indigenous peoples are back in relationship with our land, all people benefit. We know it's a fact. We make up less than 20% of the world's population, and we protect 80% of the world's biodiversity. Indigenous folks have some of the best forest management plans in the world. We have some of the most, comprehensive grasslands plans and protection plans in the world, right? Like not just in the so-called US or so-called Canada, in the world. When we fight pipelines and we fight these battles, it's not just for clean water for our own community, it's for clean water for all peoples downstream as well, right? So we know that to be true. Given that, and y'all kind of led into this already, but really thinking about, we also know that we have to collaborate, right? We are stronger together. We have to work across movements. We have to collaborate as grassroots and NGOs, right? But we also know that collaboration hasn't always been healthy, right? That collaboration has not always been equitable, and that NGOs have kind of stepped in, and misstepped in many different places, right? But also there's examples, and hopefully y'all can share with us a few of those examples of NGOs when they've actually come correct, and they've collaborated with us in a good way. So I'm curious if y'all have any examples of when you've seen an NGO come in a good way and collaborate in a good way with our communities, and if you'd be willing to share one of those examples.
I can maybe chime it in. And I like this question. I think also, I think a lot of times it's necessary to focus on what's not working, but it's also good, and we know that it's possible to be in good relation. And as much as it doesn't happen, we know that it is possible. So just kind of top of mind, I think I really like the work that Amazon Watch does, and Indigenous Climate Action. We've have a relationship with them. Many of their board members and staff are Indigenous, and I think that they work really well with community members in like a really beneficial way. I also really appreciate the work of Land Rights Now, as well as Oil Change International. And Krystal, like what you were saying earlier with like when we fight pipelines, it's not just for us, it's for everyone. And Oil Change International actually has this really incredible report in partnership with the Indigenous Environmental Network that came out 2 years ago. It's called Indigenous Resistance Against Carbon. I see some nodding, but I love this report, and I talk about this everywhere that I go to like random strangers. I'm that person, but it outlines 10 years of research that shows that Indigenous frontline resistance to oil and gas projects has actually reduced or delayed the greenhouse gas emissions of Canada and the US by about 25% of what they could have been. And so I think like uplifting that work is so important and inspiring to people to see the possibilities beyond just, wind farms and solar. Like those things are really necessary, but we also know that Indigenous rights and Indigenous sovereignty and exercising that is also a really valuable and effective climate solution. So that's, I think, top of mind for me.
Thank you, Carole. This is Niria. So what is coming to mind right now is remembering when we were sitting in this gym in the middle of the pandemic, wondering how or what the next step was for our community, given that we had just lost over 2,500 homes overnight. So Don Leonzo, one of our elders, tasked me and my friend Erika to, he didn't know how to do the internet or the computer stuff. So they had us, like going on Google and looking up, like, what are organizations that can help us, be a part of this rebuild and recovery work that is going to be ongoing for forever after this. And one organization that we've had the honor of working with is Casa of Oregon. And it's really felt like it's been a good working relationship, because they are not trying to play the role that is ours to play. They are playing the role that is theirs to play, right? Like the Eagles don't be trying to do what the Bears do, and the Bears don't be trying to do what the Wolves do, right? I think a lot of times that's where the friction and the harm happens, where organizations with lots of power, lots of access to capital, lots of access to social capital, try to speak for us, try to think they know what's best for us, instead of bringing us into the spaces that they already have access to. Really doesn't, take much. It's not like we're asking for you to give us hella money. It's like, sometimes we just need to be invited to a space. Sometimes you just need to check in with us about your ideas before going off and cutting loose with ideas that really don't work for us. So I would say that there needs to be a lot of humility when working within the NGO framework around really moving with the understanding that at the end of the day, your ideas don't matter as much as the ideas of people who are going to have to live with the consequences for the rest of their life, and having the humility to recognize that, right? That yes, the nonprofit model supports the work that we're trying to advance, but before the nonprofits, there was communities, and there still are communities, right? Which are very different ways of organizing, very different forms of governance. And it's important to honor that. It's important to approach seeking to support our communities with humility and the understanding that at the end of the day, you're not going to stay there to weather out the consequences of your input or decisions. So just come with that deep knowledge and willing to contribute whatever it is that you can.
I'll just quickly add to that. I kind of work in the Indigenous feminism sphere. So I am kind of working in a lot of feminist groups. And I would say I have a fairly good relationship with WeCan. It's women, environmental, I had to look them up because I can't, all these acronyms are so hard, but it's Women's Earth and Climate Action Network International. And they're always trying to uplift Indigenous voices globally. You know, I just had a conversation with one of my white friends, and she's like, you know, white people need to be making the Google slides and the forms, and, you know, they need to be elevating Indigenous voices. And I was like, huh, you know, because we were talking about these marches for Palestine, and it's a lot of non-Indigenous are non-BIPOC people leading it. And I think that's great, but I also think there needs to be BIPOC leadership in this. And so in a lot of, so I really like it when organizations step to the side, off-center themselves and center Indigenous people, and do it in a good way, not in a performative way, because that is something that gives me a lot of red flags. I like to be included on panels. I like to be involved, but I don't like to be tokenized, and I don't like to feel like I was just a box to be checked. So I have had some really good, there's the Feminist New Green Deal. I went to that last winter, and I really expected a lot of non-BIPOC folks. I expected it to be mostly white women, and I was shocked to see that it was mostly BIPOC feminists that were there talking about the Feminist New Green Deal. And that gives me so much hope that I feel like there is a difference. I feel like BIPOC and Indigenous women are coming more and more into leadership, and they're entering more spaces that, and we are actually setting the tone of those spaces. Like, we're not being brought in and not being like, you know, because a lot of times we were brought in and we were told the narrative, what we were going to say. And if we didn't stick to that narrative, we were booted. And I think through experience, through years, like I'm almost 50, and I've navigated so many situations where I can start understanding when I'm going to be silenced or when I'm going to be censured. And I won't be on that. Is if I can't speak my true voice, then there's no point in being on a panel. So I just want to say that I've had negative and positive experiences. As of the last few years, I've had more experiences with non-Indigenous NGOs than I have before. And I feel like they are trying to learn more. Maybe they're in some book clubs or something, I'm not sure.
Thank you for that, Claire. Yes, we've been seeing the shift and the transition, right? And I know time is flying and we are at our last questions. So I'm actually going to summarize a little bit and like think about, you know, we know that Native peoples, Indigenous peoples are completely underrepresented in leadership at NGOs, right? We know that most especially within that, Indigenous women are even more underrepresented. Curious, and Claire started to move into this, Niria, Carole started to move into this a little bit, but what are examples of moments that you felt empowered or you felt supported within the movement, within the climate justice space, within the environmental justice space, as examples for the rest of the movement to follow, right? So examples of when you felt empowered, you felt supported within this movement, and sharing that out, and that'll wrap us up and we'll move into questions and answer. Anyone want to jump in? Niria, do you have any thoughts?
Well, you just took me back to COP25. I was a youth climate organizer. I still qualified, whatever. The age gap is different. And we had said that Sustain Us was traditionally a Ivy League, Euro-American, white-led youth nonprofit. And my brother Michael and I were like, let's have a all Indigenous delegation. Why not? Like, it's, you know, there's been all white delegations and no one questioned it, whatever. So there was surprisingly no resistance to the idea, and we were coming in like, well, we want it to be like all Indigenous youth. And it was so amazing to have full support from people. There was no questioning that that's what needed to happen, right? I think a lot of times we'll bring ideas to the table, or we'll bring proposals to the table, and it's like, oh, no, that's not what's most important. So there's always that questioning that sometimes silences us or makes us feel like what we're contributing is not valued and may as well save our breath, right? So there was no questioning. There was full support to connect us with funders. So we had a fully funded delegation. We were able to dream into like, well, what's the stipend? How can we pay our youth, right? There are so many delegates that year who didn't even have a passport. They've never left the country. It's like, great, let's add that to the budget. Like, we need to pay for their passports. Like, it just felt like we were removing barriers for our participants that some people never even would think would be a barrier. And people were willing, right? We had the power to dream into what the priorities were. We didn't, you know, our budget was flexible because there was just so much flexibility and trust in moving in an emergent way. And that made me feel like, wow, we can and we should lead. And we got to show up in such a powerful and beautiful way. And it was one of the most difficult experiences because COP inherently is a difficult space to be in, but very transformational. And I think it required a lot of relinquishing the need for power and control on behalf of our allies, which, you know, is so hard, right? Because you always want to predict what's going to happen. And spirit and the ancestors do not move in predictable ways, right? There's that saying that like, you can plan your life and God will laugh, because creator, sometimes God, Jesus, Buddha, whoever you praise, ancestors always have bigger plans for us. And so we have to practice surrendering and being ready to just see what will emerge if we leave space for emergence to happen. That's one story, and I want to hear from Claire or Carole if there's other stories.
Thank you. Claire?
So this will be my first COP. I did go to the United Nations Indigenous People Permanent Forum last April. That was really beautiful. But I think I'm going to speak more to my local community in Montana and how I work with a few non-Indigenous organizations. One is the Jeanette Rankin Peace Center. I'm on the board, and I've always been really skeptical. But whenever I need anything, I'm very heavily involved with the Murder Missing Indigenous Women and Relative movement. And on every reservation, we have a high number. And so last spring, when I was in April, a Micah Westwolf was hit and run on a reservation. And so I came back and I went to the family and asked what I could do to help. And they asked for a walk, you know, a 4-day walk. And I'm like, oh, yikes, that's a lot. But, and I went to this non-Indigenous organization, Jeanette Rankin Peace Center. And I was like, I need help. I need funding, you know, if you want to show up, you can, but I need the logistics, you know, and so I told them, and it's really nice to be able to, I've been doing so much of the heavy lifting, so much of the logistics, and it's really nice to be able to have an organization take those roles on. So I could actually focus on the real work of advocacy, of writing papers, and, you know, I mean, it just going to talk to the district attorney. So I feel like there are a lot of ways to support Indigenous organizers. I go to Missoula, Montana a lot for rallies because there are a lot of non-Indigenous people that will show up to events. It's a little hard to organize on the reservation. The 4-day walk was on the reservation, and that was probably the best and well attended walk that we've ever had. We would have 50 to 100 people every day, but it's hard to gain momentum. And I feel like we're all in this together. You know, I mean, a murder missing Indigenous woman or relative affects all of us, whether or not we're Indigenous or not. Climate catastrophe affects us all, and everything is tied together. So I think that it's so important for all of us to at least try to work together, but also be discerning in who you're working with as well. And it's difficult to navigate that, but I do really appreciate the non-Indigenous partnerships that I have made to make sure that it takes a little bit of pressure off of me. And like I said, I'm going back to the whole, you know, the non-Indigenous folks should be doing the logistics and the heavy lifting, and instead of Indigenous women doing all of the labor. I'm seeing that shift, and I'm really grateful for that. So I appreciate this. I really like that question. I don't know if you have anything to say, Carole.
Yeah, I love this question, and just like hearing from both of my co-panelists. I think in general, like I can tell when an organization reaches out to me and they ask me to speak on a panel or something. I can tell when they're familiar with working with Indigenous people or they're not. I think something like Niria mentioned, like a lot of it is the money aspect. I really appreciate when I'm asked to speak or travel, and an organization pays for my hotel in advance, when they give me my per diem in advance, all of these things to like address these like actual like long-standing inequities. When you're booking travel for people or per diems, you can't assume that everybody has a credit card. You can't assume that everybody even has a passport or is familiar with travel. And so I can always tell when people aren't familiar. And so, and again, like that part of like being a good relative, I think that shapes a lot of how people can show up and support us. And I think in general, as Indigenous people, as Indigenous women, like we are fundamentally trying to work within a system that just wasn't made for us. And so there's like a certain level of flexibility that needs to be afforded to us. An understanding of things like childcare is really important. I think spaces that aren't open and welcoming for children are not welcoming for women fundamentally. Again, like for elders, accessibility, all of these things are important and necessary. They're not just like a nice little add-on, like these are rights that people have, and creating those spaces for us to uplift us is like really important. And so I think that just like that flexibility is really important. And like sometimes, you know, we're not always the best with like answering emails and all these kinds of things, but just like having that understanding. I think all of the Indigenous people that I know and the women that I know are always have a million things on the go. And so just like that flexibility and understanding and being a good relative. And I think that's it from me. I think there's some room for Q&A now.
Yeah, we may have one really quick if we move fast. So I will just grab maybe one question or two questions, and if we can move quickly through them, that would be perfect and we can answer those. Someone asked, what's some advice that you can give to someone who's trying to be more inclusive to Indigenous folks and traditional ecological knowledge in the workspace, but receives pushback from other people, especially partner organizations? It's a challenge to speak up when the space is non-Indigenous. So do y'all, maybe one or two of y'all have advice on that? And then maybe we could squeeze one more question in.
In those situations, I always ask, like, is there a mission statement of your organization? You know, I mean, like, I always go to like, how can you be more inclusive? Does your mission statement have any kind of inclusive language in it? If it does, go to those. You know, I mean, always go to, I have a legal background, so I'm always like, go to what you have. The other thing is, you know, I mean, maybe the board, go to the board possibly. That's another solution of getting support for inclusivity. And I'm not sure if anyone else has any comments.
Yeah, I like to say, is this a real emergency or not? Because I think in capitalist, settler world, there's like this false sense of urgency all the time, as well as like, can you be curious about what's going on in this person's life and what may be more important to them? Like, instead of like, well, they don't respond to my it's like, are they okay? Have you checked in with them? To see if they're okay, if their community is okay, because a lot of times when, as matriarchs, as mothers, daughters, we are always caring for our elders, our parents, our grandparents, our children. So yes, work comes second. Work will come second to my family. Yeah, I don't know if Carole has anything to add, or back to you, Krystal.
Yeah, I think everybody summed it up really effectively, but yeah, when it comes to like, especially things like traditional ecological knowledge, and the importance of that, who understanding that Indigenous people have been on our territories and our homelands since time immemorial. Nobody knows those better than us. We have generations of observational knowledge, and that is a form of science. And we know that, and we see how Western science is only now catching up to things that we've known for millennia. So even things like organizations like the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, they are only now, addressing things like colonialism being a driving factor of climate change. And that's, decades of tireless work by Indigenous people. But I think just having some of those statistics, that Oil Change International report that I mentioned, things like that, in addition to like your values and mission statement, like Claire mentioned, guiding those to have like just like a full rounded, pushback. And again, like just pushing back on that and challenging, I think is really important. So I don't know if there's room for one more.
Yeah, really quickly, I think if we give really brief responses, what role can foundations play in creating better funding opportunities for Indigenous women?
So I will jump on that one real fast. I find that a lot of grants have a lot of restrictions. They have a lot. I mean, right now we're working with, can't even call it a grant, but they just want to give us money. They don't really have a lot of report. I mean, tediousness, the tediousness of grants, the amount of work that we have to do, the labor that comes with it. I feel like there's almost a little bit of a shift, and because a lot of it, we're saying we can't do all of the work that you want us to do in the time frame, and on top of all of these reports that you want us to generate as well. Like, of course, you'll get a product, but they're very confining. So I feel like if these funds can be less confining and give us more autonomy of what we can do with these funds, because we know, just like we are 80% of the stewards of biodiversity, we know what to do with these funds, but they are very limiting sometimes. Some of the ways that they're given and the way that we can only spend on certain areas are too constrictive. And I'll pass that on.
Yeah, I think like what Claire said is really key. It's like, and I would say also in general, like we are doing this work, and we have been doing this work on very little resources. And so just making funding like really like understanding that we've been doing this work and we're going to continue this work with or without funding, just making that easier, core funding, all of those kinds of things. As well as like acknowledging that we're seeing industry fund things more than a lot of like philanthropy. So addressing that inequity of like that effort is being made to like ensure continued extraction. And so if you're a philanthropy organization, like trying to think of like, well, how can we match this and support Indigenous people who are doing the work, have been doing the work, and will continue to do the work. And I think that's it for me.
Yeah, Niria, do you have last thoughts?
Yes, philanthropy. Be our partners, like real partners, like hand in hand, like you're investing in us because your survival depends on it. Resource us like you know that. Play your role so we can play ours. And don't hide behind the professionalism. Don't be afraid to connect with us and have real moments. I feel like a lot of times there's this, there's this like thing that happens and we ain't gonna get nowhere. I mean, we're not getting anywhere with that. Like, we need to not be afraid to be in relationship with one another, experiment together and learn together, right? Because it's gonna take collaboration. It's gonna take all of us on this ship to steer this clear from disaster any more than we've already endured. So yeah, work on being real partners and creating and building authentic relationships with us.
Wow, thank you all so much. Claire, Niria, Carole, thank you so much. And thank you to everyone that joined us today. We really appreciate you. We know that there's a million different places y'all can be. What we've heard today is the power of Indigenous women, the power of Indigenous women leadership, and investing in that in very real ways that take out professionalism, that take out the patronizing tone, right? And really uplifting and empowering these voices and this leadership in this space. And also organizing at the roots, right? Like really knowing that climate change is a result of settler colonialism, of white supremacy, and racial capitalism, and that Indigenous peoples have been and will continue to lead us through these things, right? Through climate catastrophe, through climate change. And so that's where we have to invest, right? Like that's where we have to uplift these voices, and we heard it here today. So again, thank you to everyone that joined us. Thank you to the hosts and folks that hosted us today. We really appreciate you, and thank you for the conversation. I hope everyone has a good rest of their day.